Rebecca Harrison had never been the kind of woman who let things slide. She had spent the past 15 years running her ranch with the same discipline and determination that had once made her one of the most sought-after agricultural consultants in the state. But unlike the corporate world she had left behind, where she dealt with spreadsheets, profit margins, and sterile boardroom discussions, her ranch was tangible, something she could touch, shape, and build with her own two hands. Every morning before the sun broke the horizon, she was out in the fields, checking the irrigation lines, inspecting the condition of the soil, and ensuring that her small herd of horses was well fed and healthy. It was a life of hard work and quiet satisfaction, a life she had chosen over the cutthroat, artificial battles of big business. Here, on these acres of land passed down from her father, she was in control, or at least she had been. The first sign that something was wrong came just before dawn, when an unfamiliar vibration hummed through the floorboards of her house. Rebecca had always been a light sleeper, conditioned by years of waking before dawn, and the sensation was enough to pull her out of a shallow sleep. For a moment she lay still, trying to place the sound. It was deep and steady, a rhythmic tremor that felt like distant thunder, except there was no storm in the forecast. She sat up, swung her legs over the edge of the bed, and pressed her bare feet against the wooden planks, feeling the subtle but undeniable reverberation beneath her. Her first thought was an earthquake, but as she glanced at the glass of water on her nightstand, the surface barely rippled. Whatever it wasn't coming from underground. Pulling on a pair of jeans and a heavy flannel shirt, she stepped into her boots and grabbed the flashlight from the shelf near the door. The air outside was cool and dense with the scent of damp earth, the lingering moisture of the previous night's irrigation clinging to the grass. The sky was still dark, but a faint glow stretched along the horizon, a whisper of the coming sunrise. She moved down the porch steps and paused, listening. The sound was louder now, closer, a deep mechanical rumble, the kind of noise that only heavy machinery could make. As she crested the small hill that sloped down toward her pastures, her stomach clenched. There, moving methodically across her land, was a road roller. Its massive steel drum crushed the soil beneath it, compacting the ground in a way that sent a sickening realization through her. Behind it, a line of dump trucks followed, spilling gravel in a wide strip over the freshly flattened earth. And standing at the edge of the site, overseeing the operation as though he had every right to be there, was Bradley Shaw. Rebecca's hands clenched into fists. Bradley had bought the neighboring property just over a year ago, a sprawling estate that had once belonged to an elderly couple who couldn't keep up with the rising property taxes. From the moment he had moved in, he had made it clear that he saw himself as more than just another landowner. He considered himself a developer, a visionary, as he had so smugly put it the first time they'd spoken. He had grand plans for the area, boasting about infrastructure improvements, commercial opportunities, and the inevitable rise in property values that would come from his investments. But she had never agreed to sell him a single acre of her land. She stormed down the hill, her boots kicking up dust as she crossed the field toward the encroaching machinery. The closer she got, the more the damage became apparent. Rows of carefully cultivated grassland were crushed beneath the weight of the equipment, tire tracks gouged deep trenches into the once rich soil. And the small irrigation channel that ran through the field had been completely filled in with gravel. She didn't bother calling out, her voice would have been lost in the roar of the machines, so instead, she stepped directly into their path, waving her arms to get the driver's attention. The road roller groaned to a stop, and behind it, the rest of the convoy halted. A few of the workers exchanged glances but said nothing, waiting for their boss to make the next move. Bradley took his time walking over, his expression one of practiced indifference. He was dressed as though he were headed to a business meeting rather than a construction site, wearing pressed slacks and a crisp button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, just enough to suggest he was ready to get his hands dirty. His smile was patronizing, the kind of smirk that suggested he had already anticipated this confrontation and considered it nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Rebecca," he said smoothly, stopping a few feet away from her. "You're up early." She ignored the pleasantries, pointing sharply at the road roller behind him. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" He sighed, shaking his head as though she were a child throwing a tantrum. "It's just a road," he said, gesturing toward the strip of gravel behind him. A much-needed improvement, if we're being honest. You know as well as I do that this old dirt path isn't cutting it anymore. This isn't a dirt path, Bradley, she snapped. This is my land. His expression didn't change. If anything, his smile widened. Rebecca, come on. Let's be reasonable. I'm doing you a favor here. This road will increase accessibility to your property, make it easier to transport supplies, improve your property value. I don't need my property value improved. I need you to get your equipment off my land. His smile faltered, just for a moment, before he exhaled heavily and rubbed the bridge of his nose as if she were exhausting him. Look, he said, lowering his voice as though he were about to share some great wisdom with her. The truth is, this was always going to happen. The county is expanding development in this area. Infrastructure is inevitable. You can fight it or you can benefit from it. Her heart pounded with rage, but she forced herself to stay calm. You don't have permission to be here, she said, her voice like steel. You have no legal right to build anything on my land. For the first time, he hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, but she caught it. I have the necessary approvals, he said, his voice smooth again, but now with a slight edge of irritation. Everything is in order. Then show me the paperwork. A long pause. Then, instead of an answer, he simply chuckled and turned away. Rebecca, you're making this harder than it needs to be. She felt a deep, unsettling certainty settle in her stomach. He had no paperwork, no permission. He was counting on her not being able to stop him. Her hands tightened into fists. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Rebecca didn't move. She stood her ground, her boots firmly planted in the dirt, staring at Bradley's retreating back as he turned toward the construction site. The arrogance of it, the sheer audacity, sent a hot pulse of anger through her chest, but she forced herself to keep a level head. She wasn't a fool. She knew that anger alone wouldn't win this fight. If Bradley was already laying down gravel, that meant he was confident that no one would stop him, and confidence like that didn't come out of nowhere. He had to believe he had enough leverage, whether legal, financial, or bureaucratic, to keep her from shutting him down. She needed to move quickly. Ignoring the construction workers who were still lingering nearby, watching to see what she would do next, Rebecca pulled out her phone and dialed the sheriff's office. The dispatcher answered on the second ring, her tone neutral, professional, and entirely uninterested when Rebecca explained the situation. You're saying they're on your land? The dispatcher asked. Yes, Rebecca said, barely keeping her voice steady as she glanced at the deep tracks the machinery had left in her soil. They've already started construction. They've torn up part of my pasture and filled in my irrigation trench. Do you have any property markers? Rebecca clenched her jaw. Of course I have markers. I've owned this land for 15 years. The dispatcher exhaled slowly, as if she were dealing with a minor inconvenience. Ma'am, this sounds like a civil matter. If there's a property dispute, you'll need to take it up with the county. He's trespassing, Rebecca said firmly. That's a criminal offense. The silence on the other end was thick with hesitation. Did you ask them to leave? Of course I did. And did they refuse? Rebecca exhaled sharply, pushing down her frustration. Yes, and they're still here, tearing up my land. I need a deputy out here now. There was another long pause before the dispatcher finally said, I'll send someone out, but if this is a civil dispute, they may not be able to intervene. Rebecca knew what that meant. It meant the sheriff's office wasn't going to do anything. The deputy would come out, take a look around, maybe have a polite conversation with Bradley before shrugging and saying it was out of their hands. She had seen it happen before. Rich men like Bradley knew exactly how to manipulate the system, how to operate in that gray area where nothing was quite illegal enough for law enforcement to take immediate action. Still, it was a start. She ended the call and turned back toward Bradley, who was now speaking with one of the foremen. He didn't even glance in her direction, as if she had already been dismissed. But Rebecca wasn't done yet. She strode toward him, stepping right into his line of sight. The sheriff's office is sending a deputy, she said, watching his reaction carefully. Bradley barely blinked. That's fine, she narrowed her eyes. You don't seem very concerned. Because I'm not. He glanced down at his watch, then smiled at her like a man indulging a particularly slow-witted acquaintance. I have the necessary approvals, Rebecca. I told you that already. If you want to waste your time calling the sheriff, be my guest. But when they get here, they'll tell you the same thing I did. This road is happening whether you like it or not. Something about the way he said it made her stomach twist. She took a slow breath, keeping her expression neutral. If you have approvals, then there should be records with the county. Of course, Bradley said smoothly. Then you won't mind if I check. Bradley's smile didn't falter, but something shifted in his posture, something small, almost imperceptible, but Rebecca caught it. A slight tension in his shoulders, the briefest flicker of irritation in his eyes. He didn't want her digging. That was all the confirmation she needed. She didn't waste another second on him. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked back toward her truck, dialing another number as she climbed into the driver's seat. Marjorie Tate answered on the first ring. Rebecca Marjorie had worked in the county clerk's office for over 2 decades, and if anyone could get her the information she needed, it was her. Marjorie, I need a favor, Rebecca said, starting the engine. I need to know if there's been any permit filed for road construction on my land. Marjorie made a thoughtful noise. That doesn't sound right. I would have remembered something like that. I need you to check, Rebecca insisted. All right. Give me a few minutes. Rebecca ended the call and pulled onto the main road, her tires kicking up dust as she headed toward town. She had barely driven 5 miles when her phone rang again. She answered immediately. You were right, Marjorie said, her voice tight. There's no permit, no application, no records, nothing. As far as the county is concerned, no one is supposed to be building anything on your property. Rebecca tightened her grip on the steering wheel. Then how the hell is he getting away with this? Marjorie hesitated. I don't know. But I can tell you this, if he started construction without approval, that's a serious violation. You need to file a complaint with the county zoning board immediately. Rebecca nodded, already making a mental list of her next steps. I'll be there soon. By the time she reached the county office, the sun was fully up, and the day had settled into a deceptive calm. The building was a squat, brick structure with a faded sign out front, the kind of place that hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in over a decade. Inside, Marjorie was waiting for her, a manila folder already in hand. She looked grim as she handed it over. There's something else, she said. I checked recent property transactions in your area. Someone's been buying up land around you. Rebecca flipped open the folder, scanning the list of sales. Several large tracts of land had changed hands in the past year, all under the name of a company she didn't recognize. What is this? Marjorie leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. It's a shell corporation. No real records of who owns it, no local offices, just a P.O. box, and a lot of money. Rebecca's stomach turned. And you think Bradley is involved? I think it's a hell of a coincidence that he moved in right before these purchases started. Rebecca closed the folder. This wasn't just about a road. Bradley wasn't just expanding access to his property, he was carving a direct path to something much bigger. And he had counted on her not figuring it out until it was too late. But he had underestimated her. Rebecca had spent years navigating corporate land grabs, fighting off predatory investors who saw small farms as easy targets. She knew how this game was played, and she knew exactly how to stop it. She wasn't just going to file a complaint. She was going to shut him down completely. Rebecca had always known that power in places like this didn't just come from money, it came from who you knew, what you could get away with, and how many people were willing to look the other way when you crossed the line. Bradley Shaw had all of that on his side. He had resources, influence, and just enough charm to make people believe he was the kind of man who had the town's best interests at heart. But Rebecca wasn't going to let him use that against her. She had spent too many years watching people like him bend the system to their advantage, twisting rules and regulations into weapons that worked only for them. She had walked away from that world, but she hadn't forgotten how the game was played. She left the county office with Marjorie's folder clutched tightly in her hands, her mind already racing with the next steps. Bradley's shell corporation was a red flag. Whoever was backing him wasn't just interested in building a road. They were assembling land, and that meant they were planning something bigger than just expanding his estate. A development maybe, or a commercial project that would swallow up everything in its path. If that was the case, then the road wasn't just an illegal trespass onto her land. It was the first step in a full-scale takeover. By the time she pulled back onto her property, the sheriff's deputy had already arrived. His cruiser was parked near the construction zone, the engine idling as he stood in the middle of the mess Bradley's crew had created. He was talking to Bradley, nodding along with a look of mild disinterest, like this was just another petty land dispute that he had no intention of getting involved in. Rebecca slammed her truck door shut and strode toward them, her boots kicking up dust as she closed the distance. Bradley turned as she approached, and the smirk he gave her was so casual, so completely self-assured, that she felt a fresh wave of fury rise in her chest. "Deputy," she said, ignoring Bradley as she addressed the officer directly. "I want these men off my property. They are trespassing, and they are actively destroying my land." The deputy, a middle-aged man with the build of someone who had once been in shape but had long since given up on maintaining it, shifted his stance uncomfortably. "Miss Harrison, I understand you're upset, but from what Mr. Shaw has explained—" "I don't care what Mr. Shaw has explained," she cut in, her voice sharp. "He has no permit, no legal right to be here, and no claim to this land. I just came from the county clerk's office. There is nothing on record that gives him permission to do this." The deputy sighed, clearly reluctant to escalate the situation. "Look, these kinds of disputes get settled in court, not out here in the field." Rebecca took a step closer, her voice steady but unyielding. "A dispute happens when two people have legitimate claims. This isn't a dispute. This is trespassing. This is destruction of private property. If I walked onto Bradley's land and started ripping up his lawn, you'd have me in cuffs before I could take another step." Bradley chuckled, shaking his head. "Now, Rebecca, let's not be dramatic." She turned on him so fast that he actually took a step back. "You want to talk about dramatic? You bulldozed my irrigation system, you've cut through my fields, laid down gravel, and you're treating this like a minor inconvenience. You don't get to stand there and act like you're the reasonable one." The deputy cleared his throat, his discomfort growing. "Miss Harrison, if you want to pursue legal action, that's your right, but I can't arrest someone over a civil matter." Rebecca's hands curled into fists at her sides. She knew he wasn't going to do anything. Bradley had calculated this perfectly. He had counted on the sheriff's department, treating this like a bureaucratic headache instead of a crime. He had assumed she would either back down or get tangled in red tape long enough for him to finish what he had started. But he had underestimated her. Fine. If the law wasn't going to help her, she would handle this herself. She turned on her heel and walked back toward her truck, ignoring Bradley's smug expression as she climbed into the driver's seat. She didn't bother going back inside her house. Instead, she drove straight to her equipment shed, throwing open the heavy steel doors and stepping into the cool, dim interior. The scent of oil and earth filled the air, mingling with the faint metallic tang of machinery. Her father had taught her that a farmer had to be self-sufficient. You couldn't always count on the county, the state, or the law to protect what was yours. Sometimes you had to do it yourself. She fired up her tractor. It took less than 10 minutes for her to reach the construction zone, the massive tires rolling over the uneven ground as she steered toward the freshly laid gravel. The workers had stopped moving, watching her with wary expressions as she positioned the tractor directly in front of the road roller. She killed the engine and climbed down, crossing her arms as she faced them. "This road doesn't go any farther," she said flatly. "If you try, you're going to have to go through me." Bradley let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Rebecca, this is ridiculous." She didn't move. He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose before turning to the foreman. "Get the machinery moving again?" The foreman hesitated. The workers exchanged looks, none of them eager to be the first to challenge her. Rebecca stepped forward, her voice calm but edged with steel. "I have every right to be here. You don't. If you move that machine another inch, I will sue every single one of you for trespassing and destruction of private property." She let the words settle before adding, and I will win. Bradley's patience finally snapped. Enough of this, he said, turning to the foreman again. Move the damn roller. The worker hesitated for only a second before obeying. The engine rumbled to life, and the massive drum began to roll forward. Rebecca didn't step back. Instead, she grabbed the crowbar from the side of her tractor and drove it down into the gravel, wedging it under the surface with a hard, practiced shove. Then she twisted, leveraging the bar against the weight of the machine. The workers shouted as the front edge of the roller hit the buried steel and lurched, the sudden resistance sending a grinding shudder through the frame. The driver yanked back on the controls, killing the engine before it could do any more damage. The silence that followed was thick and charged. Rebecca pulled the crowbar free and tossed it onto the ground at Bradley's feet. "Try me again," she said, her voice quiet but lethal. For the first time, Bradley looked uncertain. For the first time, he hesitated. And that was all she needed. Rebecca turned her back on him and walked away, the tension in the air crackling like a storm about to break. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But now he knew what he was up against. Rebecca barely slept that night. She stayed up, sitting on her porch with a rifle resting across her lap, watching the distant construction site, where Bradley's machine sat idle under the moonlight. Every few minutes she could hear the faint creak of metal shifting as the wind moved through the skeleton of the half-built road. It felt like a wound carved into her land, a deep, festering scar that she hadn't been able to stop in time. But this wasn't over. She had sent a clear message today, but she knew Bradley. A man like him didn't back down just because he was challenged. He would regroup, find another angle, another way to push forward. That was how people like him operated. They didn't quit, they adapted. She had seen it in the corporate world, watching as developers bent rules and greased the right palms to get what they wanted. Bradley would be no different. The only question was how far he was willing to go. By dawn, she had already made up her mind. If the county wasn't going to stop him, if the law wasn't going to do its job, she would force their hand. She didn't have the money or connections that Bradley did, but she had one thing he didn't. She had the land. And as long as it was hers, she could still fight. She started with the county zoning board. Marjorie had given her everything she needed, documents proving there was no permit, evidence of illegal construction, and records showing that Bradley's shell corporation had been acquiring land at an alarming rate. It wasn't just her property at risk, he was buying up everything around her, piece by piece through dummy companies and backdoor deals. She walked into the county office just as they were opening, a thick folder of paperwork tucked under her arm. The clerk at the front desk gave her a tired look, but she didn't wait for permission. She walked straight past the counter and into the office of the zoning commissioner, slamming the folder down on his desk. "We have a problem," she said. The commissioner, a heavy-set man with graying hair and the kind of face that had seen far too many of these fights, sighed heavily as he flipped open the folder. He skimmed the first few pages, then leaned back in his chair. "Miss Harrison, I understand your frustration, but these things take time. There's a process." "I don't have time," Rebecca cut in. "Bradley Shaw is actively destroying my property. I don't need a process. I need an injunction." The commissioner exhaled through his nose, flipping through more of the documents. "Look, even if what you're saying is true, these matters aren't handled overnight. There are hearings, reviews, then start the damn review." For the first time, he actually looked at her. She saw something flicker behind his eyes, something like hesitation, maybe even guilt. He knew. Maybe not the full extent of it, but he knew enough to realize she wasn't wrong. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll push this through for emergency review. But don't expect miracles." She didn't expect miracles. She expected a fight. By the time she got back to her ranch, the machines were moving again. Not the road roller this time, but bulldozers. They weren't working on her land yet, but they were clearing brush along the edge of her property, widening the path for something bigger. She could feel it in her bones. Bradley wasn't building a simple access road. He was preparing for something larger, something permanent. She parked her truck by the fence line, stepping out just as a familiar figure approached. Frank Walsh, one of her neighbors, a man who had been running cattle on his land for nearly 30 years, walked toward her with a grim look on his face. He didn't say anything at first, just spat into the dirt and folded his arms across his chest. "I heard you raised hell at the county office," he said finally. Rebecca didn't bother denying it. "Not enough hell, not yet." Frank nodded, glancing toward the construction site. "You know what they're building, don't you?" Rebecca frowned. "A road." Frank shook his head. "That ain't just a road. That's a feeder line. They're running utilities through their water, electricity. You don't put in that kind of infrastructure for a private driveway." Her stomach twisted. "You're sure?" "Damn sure," Frank muttered. "I know a guy who works for the water district. Said they got an application last month for a new supply line, something big, and it ain't for one house." Rebecca exhaled slowly. This was bigger than she thought. Bradley wasn't just expanding access to his land. He was laying the groundwork for a full-scale development. That meant zoning changes, environmental reviews, things that should have taken months, even years to approve. But he had skipped all of that. He had moved forward, as if the permits were a formality, because for men like him, they usually were. She looked back at the bulldozers, watching as they continued their slow, methodical work. The county review wouldn't stop this. Even if she got an injunction, it would take time to enforce, and by then, the damage would already be done. She needed to slow him down. That night, she made her move. She knew the construction schedule. Bradley was running a tight operation, working from dawn until late evening to push the project forward as fast as possible. That left only a few short hours where the site was unoccupied. She waited until midnight before slipping out of her house, dressed in dark jeans and a heavy jacket. She didn't take a flashlight. She knew the land well enough not to need one. The moon was enough to guide her as she made her way down toward the edge of the construction zone. The machines loomed in the darkness, their hulking forms casting long shadows over the torn-up earth. She moved carefully, staying low as she approached the nearest bulldozer. It was parked just outside her property line, its tracks still caked with dirt from the day's work. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a heavy-duty wrench. She wasn't going to destroy anything. She wasn't stupid, but she was going to make damn sure those machines wouldn't be moving in the morning. It took less than 15 minutes. A few loosened hydraulic hoses, a couple of strategically removed fuses, and the whole operation would grind to a halt until repairs could be made. By the time she slipped back into her house, the first hints of dawn were creeping over the horizon. She set the wrench on the kitchen table, poured herself a cup of coffee, and waited. The shouting started just after 6. She stepped onto her porch, hiding her smirk as she watched the construction crew scramble. Mechanics were already swarming the site, scratching their heads as they tried to figure out what had gone wrong. Bradley arrived shortly after, stepping out of his truck with a face like thunder. He barked orders, demanding answers, but no one had any. She let him fume for a few more minutes before calling out. "Something wrong, Bradley." He turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is funny?" Rebecca took a slow sip of her coffee. "I think it's interesting." Bradley stalked toward her, stopping just short of her porch steps. "You're playing a dangerous game, Rebecca." She held his gaze, unflinching. "So are you." The moment stretched, thick with unspoken threats. Then Bradley exhaled, shaking his head. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Rebecca smiled. "Neither do you, and that was the problem." Bradley didn't return to the site that day, but Rebecca knew better than to think he had given up. Men like him didn't quit. They regrouped, recalculated, and came back with a new strategy. The sabotage had bought her time, but time wasn't enough. The machines would be repaired, the crew would return, and if she didn't find a way to shut this down permanently, she would wake up one morning to find her land stripped bare, paved over, and stolen right out from under her. The following afternoon, as she was repairing the damaged irrigation trench that Bradley's road crew had filled in, she heard the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel. She wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her arm and turned, watching as a black SUV rolled up her driveway, its tinted windows gleaming under the sun. It wasn't Bradley's truck, but the sight of it sent an immediate wave of unease curling through her stomach. The vehicle came to a smooth stop, and after a few seconds, the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out. He was dressed too neatly for this part of the country: pressed slacks, polished shoes, and a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up just enough to suggest he wasn't afraid of getting his hands dirty. His dark hair was combed back, and his expression was unreadable behind a pair of sleek sunglasses. Rebecca stood her ground as he approached. "You lost?" she asked flatly. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a leather wallet, and flipped it open just long enough for her to see the identification card inside. It wasn't a badge, but it looked official. "My name is Vincent Carter," he said smoothly. "I represent certain interests that are involved in the ongoing development near your property." Rebecca narrowed her eyes. "Interest," she repeated. "That's vague." Carter smiled again. "I believe you've met Mr. Shaw. That's one way to put it." Carter nodded, slipping the wallet back into his pocket. "I understand you've raised some concerns about the construction. I'd like to offer a solution." Rebecca crossed her arms. "I'm listening." Carter took a slow breath, as if carefully choosing his words. "You've made it clear that you don't want the road on your property. That's understandable. Nobody likes to feel like their land is being taken from them. But the reality is, this development is happening. The infrastructure is already planned, the money is already invested, and resistance well. It's just going to make things harder for everyone involved." Rebecca felt her jaw tighten. For everyone involved? Or just for Bradley? Carter shrugged. "I'm here to make sure this situation doesn't escalate any further. That's all. And I'm prepared to make it worth your while." Rebecca exhaled slowly. There it was. The buyout offer. The bribe, wrapped up in polite words and a smooth delivery. She had known it was coming, she just hadn't expected them to send someone like Carter to deliver it. "And what exactly does worth my while mean?" she asked. Carter pulled a folded document from his pocket and handed it to her. She unfolded it, scanning the page. It was a purchase offer 3 times the market value of her land, enough to walk away comfortably, and enough to rebuild somewhere else. Enough to make this fight seem unnecessary. It was more than a simple offer. It was a test. If she took the money, the problem disappeared. If she refused, they would know she wasn't just another landowner holding out for a better deal. Rebecca folded the paper neatly and handed it back. "No deal." Carter didn't look surprised. He sighed, tucking the paper away. "I was hoping we could resolve this peacefully." Rebecca tilted her head. "That a threat?" "Not at all," Carter said easily. "But I'd be careful if I were you. You're making some powerful enemies, Miss Harrison." Rebecca held his gaze. "I've had worse." Carter studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "I'll let my employers know where you stand." He turned and walked back to his SUV, climbing in without another word. Rebecca watched as the vehicle disappeared down her driveway, kicking up a trail of dust in its wake. She exhaled, running a hand through her hair. She had expected Bradley to try something like this, but she hadn't realized how deep his connections went. This wasn't just about a road anymore. This was bigger, and she was running out of time. That night she barely slept. Every sound outside made her muscles tense. Every shadow on the wall felt like a warning. She checked the locks twice, then 3 times, pacing the length of her house with restless energy. She wasn't scared, not exactly, but she was on edge. Carter hadn't threatened her outright, but his message had been clear. They'd back down, or else. By morning, she had made a decision. If they were going to play dirty, she would too. She spent the day preparing. She reinforced her fences, double-checked the security cameras she had installed months ago, and made sure everything of value was locked down tight. Then, just as the sun was setting, she took a drive, not to the county office, and not to Bradley's construction site. She drove to an old barn at the far end of her property, one that had been there since her grandfather's time. She hadn't used it in years, had barely even set foot inside, but tonight she had a reason. She parked the truck and stepped inside, inhaling the scent of dust and old wood. It took a few minutes of searching before she found what she was looking for: an old metal lockbox, half buried beneath a pile of rusted tools. She pulled it out, set it on a workbench, and popped the latch. Inside were stacks of old documents, some yellowed with age, others still crisp. Deeds, records, surveys, everything her family had ever owned, right down to the last inch of dirt. She flipped through them quickly, scanning for anything useful. And then she found it. A legal document, nearly 70 years old. She read it once. Then again. Then she smiled. By the time she pulled back onto the main road, the pieces had already started falling into place. She knew exactly how she was going to stop Bradley. He thought he was untouchable. But he had made a critical mistake. And tomorrow he was going to find out just how wrong he was. Rebecca woke before dawn, her mind already racing through every detail of what she had found. The document from her grandfather's time wasn't just old paperwork, it was a legal barrier, a forgotten land restriction buried under decades of newer transactions that Bradley had never accounted for. It detailed an easement agreement made in the late 1950s, a binding contract that explicitly forbade any industrial or commercial development on her land or the adjacent properties without the express written consent of the original landowners. The landowners at the time had been her family, and now the sole heir to that agreement was her. Bradley had built his entire project on a lie. She had spent the rest of the night making copies, highlighting the relevant sections, and preparing everything she needed. This wasn't just leverage, this was the kill shot. By the time the sun crested over the horizon, she was already dressed, armed with a thick file of legal documents, and ready to end this fight once and for all. She drove straight to the construction site, her truck kicking up dust as she pulled onto the torn-up road. The workers were already moving, machinery roaring to life as they resumed their work. But something was different today. Bradley was there, standing at the edge of the site, his phone pressed to his ear, his expression tense. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't gloating. He looked pissed. Rebecca parked and climbed out, tucking the folder under her arm as she approached. Bradley turned before she even reached him, his eyes narrowing. "What the hell did you do?" he snapped. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "Good morning to you too, Bradley." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Don't play games with me. I just got a call from the county. They're putting a hold on my permits. My entire project is frozen." Rebecca let out a soft breath, feigning surprise. "You don't say." Bradley's jaw tightened. "You went to the zoning board again, didn't you?" She smiled, slow and deliberate. "Oh, I went a little further than that." She pulled the folder from under her arm and handed it to him. He hesitated before yanking it open, his eyes scanning the pages. As he read, she watched his expression shift: confusion first, then frustration, then something sharper. Panic. "This is bullshit," he muttered, flipping to the next page, then the next. "It's legally binding," Rebecca said calmly. "That easement was signed nearly 70 years ago. It was never overturned, never amended, never bought out. Which means that you are in violation of a legally protected land agreement, and since you never bothered to check the historical land records before you started this mess, you've built an entire development plan on a foundation that doesn't legally exist." Bradley shook his head, gripping the folder so tightly his knuckles went white. This can't hold up. It's too old. The county won't enforce something this outdated." Rebecca tilted her head. "Oh, they will. And they already have." She let that sink in before continuing, her voice steady and unyielding. "I filed an emergency motion with the county zoning board this morning. By the time your crew started up their machines, your project was already on hold. And the best part? The penalty for violating a land easement like this? It's not just a fine, Bradley." She smiled coldly. "It's an automatic injunction, and if you keep working on this road, you'll be in contempt of court." Bradley's breath came out sharp. He closed the folder, gripping it like he wanted to rip it in half. "You think this is over?" "I know it is." For the first time since this all started, Rebecca saw at the moment of realization in his eyes. He had lost. and no amount of money, no amount of bribes or legal loopholes was going to fix it. He had bet on her being another powerless landowner, another farmer too small to fight back. He had bet wrong. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, his voice lower now, almost measured. "You think this is just about me? I'm not the one pulling the strings here. You've made enemies, Rebecca, real ones." She stared at him, her pulse steady. "Then let them come." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, something on the edge of a much bigger war. But for now, this battle was over. Bradley took one last look at the folder, then tossed it onto the ground between them. "You have no idea what you've just done," he muttered. Rebecca didn't flinch. "And you have no idea who you were dealing with." Bradley turned on his heel, stalking toward his truck, his shoulders tense with barely restrained rage. He climbed in, slammed the door, and gunned the engine. Rebecca watched as he tore down the half-built road, kicking up dust as he disappeared over the horizon. The construction workers stood frozen, waiting for orders that would never come. Rebecca took a slow breath, letting the moment settle over her. She had won. For now. The silence that followed Bradley's departure was thick and unnatural, like the land itself was holding its breath. The moment he had peeled away in his truck, the workers had begun gathering their equipment, exchanging uncertain glances, as if waiting for someone to tell them what to do. Without Bradley barking orders, without the weight of his money and influence pressing down on them, they were just men with machines standing on land that didn't belong to them. Some hesitated, glancing toward Rebecca as if she might suddenly change her mind and let them stay. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. One by one, they shut down their engines, packed their gear, and started hauling their machinery off her property. She stood her ground, watching as the road roller, the bulldozers, the gravel trucks, all the instruments of destruction that had been tearing through her fields were driven away. By the time the last one disappeared over the ridge, the only thing left behind was a half-finished scar of crushed soil and a deep trench where her irrigation system had once run. It would take months to fix. Maybe years, but it was hers. She turned, scanning the landscape, taking in the damage. The land wasn't the same as it had been before Bradley came, but it was still standing, and as long as it was standing, she could rebuild. By the time the sun started setting, the word had spread. Frank Walsh was the first to show up, driving his battered old truck up her driveway like he'd been waiting for this moment. He stepped out, leaning against the door with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the now empty construction site. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, pulling a toothpick from his pocket and sticking it between his teeth. "Didn't think you'd pull it off." Rebecca exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain from her shoulders. Neither did he. Frank nodded, running a hand over his jaw. "He'll be back," he said finally. "Not Bradley, maybe, but someone else. Men like him don't quit." They regroup. Rebecca knew he was right. This wasn't just about Bradley anymore. He had made that clear before he left. She had disrupted something bigger, something that had been in motion long before she realized what was happening. Bradley had been a front, a face to put on the project, but the real money, the real power was still out there. "Let them come," she said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." Frank smirked. "Didn't think you would." He pushed off the truck and turned to go, but then paused, looking back at her. "You need anything, you holler. You ain't the only one tired of watching this county get sold off piece by piece." Rebecca met his gaze and nodded. She hadn't asked for allies, but it seemed she had them anyway. Over the next week, she worked tirelessly to undo as much of the damage as she could. The road itself was still there, an ugly gash of gravel and compacted dirt cutting through her fields, but she wasted no time reclaiming it. She hauled broken irrigation pipes back into place, dragged fencing materials to where her boundary lines had been disrupted, and spent hours with her hands in the dirt, feeling the land, reconnecting with it. And then, one morning, she saw the SUV. It was different from Carter's, but just as polished, just as expensive. It pulled up to her gate and idled there, the driver making no move to step out. Rebecca stood on her porch, watching. A minute passed. Then two. Finally, the window rolled down, and a voice smooth, polite, but undeniably authoritative called out, "Miss Harrison." Rebecca didn't respond. The man leaned slightly toward the open window. She could see the sharp lines of his suit, the gleam of a watch that probably cost more than her truck. "I won't take much of your time," he said. "I just came to deliver a message." Rebecca waited. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've made your point. You won this round. But this isn't over. People with real money don't just walk away. You've been lucky so far, but luck runs out." Rebecca stepped off the porch, walking slowly toward the gate, stopping just a few feet from the SUV. She let the silence stretch before she spoke. "This isn't luck," she said. "This is my land, and I know every inch of it better than you ever will." The man tilted his head, studying her like she was a particularly interesting puzzle. "We could make this easier for you," he said. "One offer. One time. Something fair. No more surprises." Rebecca held his gaze. "There's nothing fair about any of this." The man sighed, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. "Suit yourself." He rolled the window back up, and a moment later the SUV was gone. Rebecca stood there, watching the dust settle in its wake. She had won the battle, but the war was still coming. That night, she sat on her porch, staring out at her land. It was quiet again. No machines, no intrusions, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees, the distant hum of crickets in the fields. She took a deep breath, letting it settle in her chest. They would come back, but so would she. And next time, she would be ready.